The frozen mud pulled at their boots with each step, a thick, greedy sound in the grey stillness of the afternoon. A low sky, the colour of old dishwater, pressed down on the rolling, barren hills. There was no wind, only a profound and penetrating cold that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Anne walked ahead, her back straight, a line of stubbornness against the bleak landscape. Her pace was steady, a rhythm that ate the distance without hurry and without pause. Behind her, Beth's eye scanned the horizon, then the ground, then the horizon again. She saw the way the dry grass was bent in a single direction, a memory of a wind that had passed. She saw the faint tracks of a rabbit, already days old. She saw the wear on the heel of Anne's left boot. They had been walking since before dawn, leaving the orphanage behind them like a bad dream. There had been no plan, only the shared, unspoken certainty that one more day inside those walls was impossible. They carried little. A single blanket roll, a small sack with a heel of bread and a tin cup, and the clothes on their backs. And had the axe, its head wrapped in cloth and tucked into her belt, its weight a comforting, solid presence. Beth had the knife and a small coil of twine. They had walked away from the morning chores, a gap in the routine no one would notice for hours, and by then they would be just two more gone things in a world full of them. The barn appeared first as a broken tooth on the ridgeline. It was derelict, its spine bowed and shingles missing like lost scales. But it was a structure. It was a promise of a break from the relentless cold. As they drew closer, they could see the extent of its decay. The large doors hung open on broken hinges, and the wind had sculpted drifts of old leaves and dirt against the interior walls. It smelled of rotten damp earth and the faint, dusty ghost of hay. Anne dropped her blanket roll without a word and began a slow circuit of the building's perimeter. Beth went inside, her boot sinking into the soft, mulched floor. Light fell in pale, dusty shafts from the holes in the roof. The place was empty, stripped of anything useful long ago. A few splintered stalls remained, their wood silvered with age. It was in the farthest, darkest corner, behind a collapsed section of a manger, that she saw it. Not the thing itself, but the straight, unnatural line of it in the packed dirt. She knelt, brushing away the debris. It was a ring, thick and made of rusted iron, set flush into a rectangle of heavy planks. A trap door. She didn't call out. She waited until Anne's methodical inspection brought her to that same corner. Anne stopped, her gaze following Beth's to the floor. There was a moment of silence, a shared look that held a question and its answer. Together, they heaved. The wood was swollen and heavy, protesting with a groaning scrape. It lifted, revealing a square of blackness and a rush of cold, subterranean air that smelled of stone and stillness. A ladder of thick, rough-hewn rungs led down into the dark. They descended into a small, stone-lined room. It was not a root cellar, it was too finished for that. The walls were dry-stacked fieldstone, fitted with surprising care. The floor was packed earth, but level and firm. In the center of the room stood a small, pot-bellied stove, its iron body covered in a fine layer of rust but otherwise intact. A pipe ran from its top to a hole in the ceiling, which was made of the same heavy planks as the trap door. Against one wall, a low stone shelf had been built, empty save for a scattering of mouse droppings. The air was cold, but it was a dry, still cold, a world away from the damp, seeping chill of the barn above. It was a space made to be held against the world. It was a place to begin. Beth ran a hand along the cool, rough stone of the wall. It was solid. It was real. And tapped the side of the stove with a knuckle. It rang with a dull, metallic thud. Solid. They had found something. It wasn't a home, not yet. But it was a chance. The first task was to make the space their own. They worked through the fading light of the afternoon, a synchronized effort that needed no direction. And climbed back out and, with the axe, began to break down the remains of the rotten manger in the barn. The wood was old and dry, snapping easily. She worked with a focused economy of motion, her swings precise and powerful, turning the useless structure into a pile of manageable fuel. Beth remained below, her task one of reclamation. She used a piece of splintered planking as a scraper, methodically clearing the earthen floor of debris and the thin layer of dust that covered everything. She swept the stone shelf clean, her hands brushing away the tiny bones of long-dead insects and the accumulated grime of years. She found a small, rusted bucket in a corner, its bottom still sound, and used it to haul the dirt and refuse up the ladder and out into the barn. When Anne had a respectable pile of wood, she began feeding it down to Beth, who stacked it neatly against the wall near the stove. The geometry of the pile was important. It had to be stable, accessible, and allow air to circulate. Beth laid the first row with care, alternating the direction of each subsequent layer. While she worked, Anne inspected the stovepipe. She ran her hands along its length, checking the seams, ensuring the connection to the ceiling was firm. It was coated in soot but seemed structurally sound. She found the flue, a simple rotating damper, and worked it back and forth until it moved freely. Everything was a question of integrity. Did the stone wall have gaps? Did the stove have cracks? Did the ladder have rot? They moved through the space with a quiet intensity, their hands and eyes testing the world they had stumbled into. The last of the grey light was failing when Anne finally struck a spark from her flint and steel. The tinder, dry moss and shredded bark she'd gathered from the lee side of the barn, caught with a brief, encouraging flare. She fed it into the stove's small firebox, adding tiny splinters of wood, then larger ones, coaxing the flame to life. For a long time, the only sound was the hiss of dampness being driven from the old iron and the soft whisper of the growing fire. Then, a deeper sound began, a low, ticking hum as the metal heated and expanded. Smoke puffed from the seams for a moment before the draft caught, pulling it cleanly up the pipe and out of the shelter. A faint warmth began to radiate from the stove's round belly. They sat on the floor, the blanket shared across their shoulders, and watched the orange light flicker through the small grate. The warmth was more than a physical sensation, it was a bulwark. It pushed back the darkness, the cold, the gnawing uncertainty of their existence. The shelter was no longer just a hole in the ground. It had a heart now, and its heart was beating with a slow, steady pulse of heat. They ate their piece of bread, dividing it exactly in half, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire. The next day began the real work. The small pile of manger wood would not last. Fuel was life, and they needed a mountain of it. They scouted the sparse woodland that bordered the property, a thin stand of pine and scrub oak. Anne's axe was sharp, a tool she had maintained with meticulous care. They found a deadfall oak, a thick-trunked giant felled by a windstorm years ago. It was too large to buck into rounds where it lay. This was a problem of leverage and mechanics. Anne studied the trunk, her eyes tracing the lines of stress and fracture. She chose a section where the trunk was raised slightly off the ground by a broken limb. She and Beth cleared the brush around it, creating a workspace. Anne used the axe not for brute force, but for precision. She scored a deep V-cut on one side, then began chopping from the other. The chips that flew were large and clean. While Anne chopped, Beth gathered. She collected the smaller, fallen branches, dragging them back to the barn and stacking them near the trapdoor. She had a sense of order, of how things should be arranged for maximum efficiency. One pile for kindling, one for medium fuel, another for the larger logs that would come later. Their labor was a conversation. And steady chopping was a statement of progress. Beth's growing piles were the response. When Anne had cut through the massive log, they faced the problem of moving the heavy rounds. They were too much to lift. Anne found a stout pole, and using a smaller log as a fulcrum, she showed Beth how to lever the rounds up, rolling them end over end back towards the barn. It was slow, back-breaking work. Their muscles ached, and their hands were raw. But the pile of wood in the barn grew. It was a visible measure of their labor, a testament to their will. That evening, the stove glowed with the steady, intense heat of seasoned oak. The warmth filled the small stone room, pressing into the corners, making the space feel smaller, safer. They had earned it. The heat in their bones was a direct result of the sweat on their brows. It was a fair transaction, perhaps the first truly fair one of their lives. After 3 days of relentless work, they had enough firewood stacked inside the barn to last a week, maybe more. But firewood was not enough. They needed salt, flour, perhaps a better knife. They had nothing to trade but their labor, and no one to sell it to. Beth, in her methodical cleaning, had found a few things buried in the dirt floor of the barn: a set of rusted harness buckles, a broken awl, and a small, tarnished silver button. They were next to nothing, but they were not nothing. The nearest town, Coulter's Creek, was a half-day's walk to the east. They could see the thin smudge of its collective chimney smoke against the morning sky. They set out at dawn, the small collection of metal objects wrapped in a cloth in Beth's pocket, and carried the axe, its presence a quiet deterrent. The town was a single dusty street lined with a dozen unpainted wooden buildings. A mercantile, a smithy, a saloon, and a handful of small houses. It was a place of function, not beauty. People moved with a grim purposefulness, their faces closed against the cold and each other. The sisters walked down the center of the street, their worn orphanage clothes and shared silence marking them as outsiders. Heads turned. Eyes followed them, filled with a flat, weary curiosity. Gable's Mercantile was the largest building, its porch cluttered with barrels and crates. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of coffee, leather, and smoked meat. A man with a graying beard and a stained apron stood behind the counter. This was Gable. He watched them approach, his eyes missing nothing, and placed the cloth bundle on the counter and unfolded it. Gable looked down at the pathetic assortment of rusted metal and the single button. He picked up the button, rubbing the tarnish away with his thumb. "Where did you get this?" His voice was not unkind, but it was direct. "Found it, and said." It was the only answer necessary. Gable considered them for a long moment. Two girls, thin but not broken, with the same steady, serious eyes. They didn't look like trouble, just desperate. He thought of the two graves he'd helped dig for a family that hadn't prepared for the last winter. "It's not much," he said, finally. "We need flour. And salt," and stated. It wasn't a plea. It was a transaction. He weighed it in his mind. The button was worth a little. The rest was scrap. But the flour and salt might be the thing that saw them through the first snow. It was a poor investment in goods, but perhaps not in people. He sighed, a small puff of resignation. He scooped a few pounds of flour into a cloth sack and added a smaller bag of salt. He pushed it across the counter. As they were turning to leave, a woman entered the store. She was wrapped in a heavy, frayed shawl, her face a knot of hard-won disapproval. Her name was Hemlock, and she saw it as her duty to note the failings of the world. She took in the sisters, their worn clothes, the small sack of flour. "You'll not last the winter out at the old Miller place," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet store. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. "The barn's a sieve and the ground is frozen hard. You'll die out there." And did not look at her. She picked up the sack, her expression unchanged. Beth met the woman's gaze for a second, a flicker of acknowledgement, before turning to follow her sister. "We'll manage," and said, not to the woman, but to the air itself. They walked out of the store and back down the dusty street, the weight of the town's judgment on their backs. But in Ant's hand was the sack of flour, a tangible weight that mattered more than words. When they got back to the barn, the firewood stack looked taller, more defiant. They had what they needed for now. The woman's words were just noise. The work was real. The prophecy of their demise settled over them not as a fear, but as a problem to be solved. Mrs. Hemlock's words had given their work a new, sharper edge. They were not just surviving, they were proving a silent point. The barn roof was the first priority. It offered the only protection for their firewood and their entrance. Climbing onto the precarious structure was Anne's job. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, testing each beam before putting her weight on it. Beth remained on the ground, her role to find and prepare the materials for repair. She discovered a section of the barn wall, collapsed inward, where the planks were mostly sound. Using a rock to hammer the nails free, she salvaged a small stack of weathered boards. Tossing a rope over the main beam, and hauled the planks up one by one. She didn't have enough nails to refasten them properly. Instead, she used the axe to cut deep notches in the boards and the existing roof beams, fitting them together like pieces of a simple puzzle. She laid them over the largest holes, creating a rough but effective patch. To seal the smaller gaps, Beth mixed a thick paste of mud and dry grass, a primitive daub. She filled the bucket and hauled it up, smearing the mixture into the seams and cracks. It was ugly, messy work, but as the patches dried, they formed a hard, water-resistant seal. They worked all day under the disapproving grey sky, a silent, two-person construction crew against the slow decay of the world. Down in the shelter, the focus was on insulation and comfort. The stone walls were solid but radiated a deep cold. Beth had an idea. She had seen how the ground in the woods was insulated by a thick blanket of fallen pine needles and moss. She spent an entire afternoon gathering it, stuffing it into old burlap sacks she'd found rotting in a corner of the barn. She packed the sacks tightly and wedged them against the coldest sections of the stone wall. The effect was immediate. The small room seemed to hold its heat longer, the stove's warmth reflecting back into the space instead of being leached away by the earth. Their next project was a place to sleep. The cold earthen floor drew the heat from their bodies at night. They needed to get off the ground. And selected 2 of the sturdiest salvaged planks for the frame. She used the axe as a plane, carefully shaving the rough surfaces down. It was painstaking work, requiring a steady hand and a patient eye. She cut for shorter lengths for the legs, notching the top so the frame would sit securely. She didn't have nails, so she drilled holes with the heated tip of the broken awl and fashioned wooden pegs to hold the joints together. She built 2 low bunks, set one above the other against the wall. They were simple, solid, and functional. Beth took the remaining burlap sacks, washed them in melted snow, and stuffed them with the softest, driest grass she could find. The resulting mattresses were lumpy and smelled of earth, but they were a world of luxury compared to the floor. The shelter was transforming. It was becoming a home, built not with money or fine tools, but with ingenuity and relentless effort. Each improvement, every patched roof board, every insulated wall, every hand-planed bunk, was a line in a story they were writing for themselves, a story of persistence in the face of indifference. The firewood stack in the barn grew taller each day, a silent, accumulating column of security. The first snow did not arrive with the fury of a blizzard. It came quietly in the night, a soft, insistent whisper. Beth woke to a change in the quality of the silence. The world outside had gone mute. She climbed the ladder and pushed open the trapdoor a few inches. The air that met her was sharp and clean. The ground, the trees, the broken-toothed ruin of the barn roof, everything was covered in a pristine, unbroken blanket of white. The snow was still falling, thick, straight-down flakes that drifted without purpose. It was beautiful, but it was also a warning. This was the opening statement of winter. Down in the shelter, the change was barely noticeable. The stove ticked along, its iron body radiating a deep, penetrating warmth. The air was dry and comfortable. The snow on the ground above acted as another layer of insulation, muffling the outside world and trapping the heat within their small stone room. Anne was already awake, checking the wood supply they kept inside, a small stack for overnight use. She added a log to the stove, the gesture economical and practiced. They moved around each other in the small space with an unspoken understanding, the rhythm of their morning routine already established. They made a thin porridge from their flour, eating it slowly, savoring the warmth. For the first time since they had left the orphanage, Beth felt a sense of profound security. The storm was not a threat to be endured, but a thing to be observed from a position of safety. Their hard work had brought them this peace. Every log in the stack, every daub of mud in the roof, every sack of moss against the wall was a part of the fortification that now stood between them and the killing cold. She thought of Mrs. Hemlock's prediction. "You'll be frozen stiff by first snow." The woman's voice seemed to come from a great distance, a faint, irrelevant echo from another world. Here, in the warm, quiet dark of their shelter, her words had no power. They spent the day inside. The snow continued to fall, piling up in soft drifts against the barn. Anne took the time to sharpen the axe, her movements methodical and patient as she drew the whetstone along the blade. Beth mended a tear in their shared blanket, her stitches small and neat. There was no wasted time, but there was no sense of urgency. Their preparations had been for this exact moment. They were living not day to day, but season to season. Their timeline had expanded. The growing stack of firewood in the barn was not just a pile of wood, it was a visible representation of the future. It was food for the stove for weeks to come. It was safety. It was time they had claimed for themselves. As dusk fell, the snow finally tapered off, leaving behind a world transformed and silent. The glow from the stove grate painted flickering shadows on the stone walls and banked the fire for the night, the practice motion sure and steady. They settled into their bunks, the warmth trapped around them. Outside, the temperature was dropping, but inside their small pocket of the world, they were safe. They had built this safety with their own hands. After 2 days, a pale sun emerged, glinting off the new snow. The world was bright and clean. Their path from the barn to the woods was gone, buried under a foot of powder. They spent the morning clearing it, and using a wide plank as a makeshift shovel. The work was hard, but necessary. They had to maintain their access to fuel. The small supply run to town could no longer be postponed. Their sack of flour was nearly empty, and they needed more salt and perhaps some beans, something that would last. The walk to Coulter's Creek was different now. The snow muffled their footsteps, and the cold was sharper, biting at any exposed skin. The town looked hunkered down, subdued by the first real taste of winter. Smoke rose from the chimneys, but it seemed thinner, less robust than before. When they entered Gable's Mercantile, the mood inside was somber. A few men stood around the stove, their conversation sparse. Gable was behind the counter, his face etched with a familiar winter weariness. He nodded at the sisters as they entered. His gaze lingered for a moment on their faces. They were still thin, but they lacked the pinched, worried look of many of his customers. Their cheeks were chapped from the cold, but their eyes were clear. This time, they had something better to trade, and had spent an evening carefully stripping the sinew from a deer leg they had found, half-eaten by coyotes. It was strong and useful for repairs. She had also scraped and cured the small piece of hide. She placed the coiled sinew and the stiff square of leather on the counter. Gable picked them up, testing the strength of the sinew between his thick fingers, examining the quality of the hide. It was good work. Beans, and said. And flour. Gable nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. He measured out a larger portion of flour than before and added a hefty bag of dried beans. As he was tying the sacks, Mrs. Hemlock came in, her shawl pulled tight around her head. She saw the sisters, saw the supplies on the counter, and her face soured. That luck won't hold, she declared to the room at large. The real winter's coming. That first snow was just a friendly hello. When the blizzard comes, nothing you've done will matter. The earth will take you back. Anne ignored her completely, her attention focused on tying the sacks securely for the walk home. Beth watched the woman for a moment, noticing the way her hands trembled slightly, the knuckles red and raw from the cold. The woman's bitterness was a shield, but it was a thin one. The fear underneath was plain to see. It was her own fear she was projecting onto them. As they left, one of the men by the stove spoke, his voice a low rumble. Their woodpile is something to see. Stacked neat as a pin, and taller than a man. Gable grunted in agreement, his eyes following the sisters as they disappeared down the street. The town was beginning to see them not as lost children, but as a stubborn fact of the landscape. Their firewood stack, visible from the road to anyone who cared to look, was becoming a local landmark. It was a silent, irrefutable argument against the town's low expectations. It stood as a monument to their labor, a stark contrast to the smaller, less organized piles behind the town's houses. The sisters didn't hear the man's comment, but they felt the shift. It was in the way Gable had dealt with them, in the grudging absence of mockery from the other men. They were no longer just a tragedy waiting to happen. They were a curiosity. The real winter, when it came, was not a storm. It was a siege. It began with a sky that turned the color of lead, a heavy, oppressive ceiling that lowered itself onto the world. The temperature dropped steadily, a degree an hour, until the very air seemed to crackle with cold. Then the wind began, a low moan from the north that grew into a relentless, shrieking gale. The snow it carried was not the soft, drifting flakes of before, but a hard, granular ice that scoured the landscape. This was the blizzard Mrs. Hemlock had prophesied. For the town of Coulter's Creek, it was a catastrophe. The wind tore at the poorly chinked walls of their homes, driving snow through every crack. It found the weaknesses in their roofs, piling up in attics and causing beams to groan. The people, caught off guard by its ferocity, struggled to keep their fires fed. Woodpiles, left exposed, were quickly buried under immense drifts. Paths became impassable within hours. The world shrank to the four walls of a cold room and the dwindling supply of fuel. For Anne and Beth, it was a day like any other, but quieter. Down in their stone shelter, the sound of the raging blizzard was a distant, muted roar, the fury of a caged animal heard from a safe room. The earth and snow above them were the perfect insulation. The wind could not touch them. The snow could not bury them. Their world was the 10 by 10 foot space, illuminated by the steady, comforting glow of the stove. Their routine did not change. They woke, tended the fire, ate their meal of boiled beans, and set about their tasks. Their preparations had been comprehensive. They had a supply of wood inside the shelter, enough for 2 days, to avoid opening the trap door. They had a bucket of clean snow for water, which they melted on the stove. Their food was secure. The rhythm of their existence was calm and unbroken. And spent the day disassembling the broken awl and using the stove's heat to reshape the metal tip into a serviceable needle. Her focus was absolute, the small, precise taps of her hammer a counterpoint to the storm's distant howl. Beth worked on their clothes, reinforcing seams, patching worn elbows. Her hands were never idle. Their small room was a hive of quiet, productive activity. They were not just surviving the storm, they were living within it, untouched. The blizzard was not their enemy. It was merely a condition of the world, and they had adapted to that condition. There was no fear, no anxiety about the dwindling woodpile or the howling wind. There was only the steady, metronomic pulse of their work. They had foreseen this. They had labored for this. Every aching muscle from hauling wood, every splinter from planing the bunks, had been an investment in this moment of quiet, warm security. They spoke little. Words were unnecessary. The shared warmth, the smell of the hot metal of the stove, the sight of each other's focused, competent hands, these were their conversation. On the second night of the blizzard, as the wind reached its peak, Beth looked at the solid stone walls, the neatly stacked interior woodpile, and the gentle rise and fall of her sister's sleeping form in the bunk below. Mrs. Hemlock had said the earth would take them back. She had been right, in a way. The earth had taken them in, sheltered them, and kept them safe from the fury of the sky. The storm raged for 3 days and 3 nights. On the morning of the 4th day, they woke to an almost shocking silence. The wind had died. The distant roaring was gone, replaced by a profound stillness. Anne climbed the ladder and put her shoulder to the trapdoor. It was heavy, weighted down by a mountain of snow. She pushed, grunting with the effort, until it finally scraped open a few inches. A cascade of fine, powdery snow fell into the shelter. The light that filtered in was intensely bright, a pure, blue-white that made them squint. Anne pushed the door fully open and hoisted herself out. Beth followed. They stood in a world remade. The snow was immense, sculpted by the wind into huge, rolling drifts that buried fences and rose to the eaves of the barn. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Their small clearing around the barn was a deep bowl in the snow, the only break in the white expanse. Their chimney pipe, which Anne had extended with a length of scavenged tin, poked through the drift, a thin ribbon of smoke rising straight up into the still air. They looked toward the town. It was a grim sight. The collection of buildings was half buried. But the most alarming sign was the smoke. Or the lack of it. Only 2 or 3 chimneys were breathing faint wisps into the sky. The others were still and cold. A deep and worrying silence hung over the settlement. They could see a few figures struggling in the deep snow, trying to dig paths, their movement slow and exhausted. Mr. Gable was one of them, laboring to clear a way to his storefront. Even from this distance, they could see the futility of his effort. The snow was too deep, the task too large. The town had been caught unprepared. Their woodpiles were buried, their reserves inside their homes exhausted. The cold was no longer just a discomfort, it was a threat. It was seeping into the houses, claiming the warmth, endangering the young and the old. The crisis the sisters had prepared for had not been their own. It was the town's. And looked at their own firewood stack, protected inside the barn. It was high and dry and plentiful. She looked back at the town, at the still chimneys. There was no discussion. No debate. Their gazes met in a moment of shared, unspoken decision. Beth went to the barn and began clearing the snow from the runners of the small, sturdy sled they had built for hauling wood. And picked up her axe and a shovel made from a broad piece of planking. The time for isolation was over. Their competence was about to be tested in a new way. It was not enough to save themselves. The proof of their survival would be in their ability to help others. The work of helping was harder than the work of survival had been. The snow was chest-deep in places, a thick, heavy powder that resisted every movement. And went first, using the plank shovel to clear a narrow path, her breath pluming in the frigid air. Beth followed with the sled. It was a simple, functional thing and had built from salvaged barn wood, with runners that slid easily over the snow. They loaded it with seasoned oak from their protected stack. It was a heavy load, and pulling it through the deep drifts was a grueling, muscle-burning task. They leaned into the ropes, their boots sinking, their progress agonizingly slow. Their first stop was the house with no smoke at all, the one closest to the edge of town. It belonged to the Hemlock woman. The windows were dark, and a drift was piled high against the door. And cleared the snow from the porch while Beth unloaded the wood, stacking it neatly by the door. And knocked. After a long moment, the door opened a crack. Mrs. Hemlock's face appeared, pinched and blue with cold. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she saw the 2 girls, and then the pile of firewood on her porch. She looked from the wood to their faces, searching for a sign of triumph or scorn. She found none. Their expressions were as flat and practical as always. She said nothing. She simply opened the door wider, a silent invitation for them to bring the wood inside. They piled it next to her cold hearth. When they were done, she gave a single, curt nod. It was not a thank you. It was an acknowledgement of a debt, a concession in a war she had been fighting alone. That was enough. They repeated the process throughout the town. They hauled load after load from their barn, leaving piles of life-saving fuel on the porches of the coldest houses. They didn't speak to anyone. The act itself was the only message. The sight of the 2 girls, appearing out of the frozen landscape with their sled of wood, became a strange, recurring miracle. People emerged from their homes, their faces a mixture of shame and gratitude. They had mocked these girls, predicted their deaths, and now those same girls were the source of their salvation. Their last stop was Gable's Mercantile. The merchant was exhausted, his face grey with fatigue. He had been trying to get his stove going again, but his own wood was damp and frozen. He watched as they stacked a generous pile of dry oak by his door. "I have no cash," he said, his voice rough. "But your credit is good. For whatever you need. For as long as you need it." It was the highest form of praise in his world. It was a statement of trust, of belonging. "We'll manage," and said, the same words she had used before, but now they held a different weight. They were no longer a defiant hope, but a statement of proven fact. As they were preparing for one last trip, the town blacksmith, a large man named Soren, approached them. He didn't look at them, but at their sled. He ran a hand over the joints, noting the tight, peg-fastened construction. He looked at the clean, efficient way and had cleared the path. "Who taught you to build like this?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "No one," Anne replied. "I just thought about what needed to be done." Soren grunted, a sound of approval. "You have an eye for it. And a good arm. When the thaw comes, I need help at the forge. The work is hard, but it pays." It was not charity. It was an offer of employment. It was legitimacy. They had arrived not as supplicants, but as equals. The great thaw began a week later. The world started to drip. Icicles that hung from the eaves of the barn grew heavy and fell with soft thuds into the slush. The snowpack shrank, revealing the muddy ground beneath. Coulter's Creek slowly came back to life, its chimneys all smoking, its people digging out from the blizzard siege. The sisters were no longer invisible. When they walked into town, people nodded. The nods were respectful, acknowledging. Mrs. Hemlock was seen one afternoon, leaving a small jar of preserved peaches on the edge of their cleared path. She did it without being seen, a silent, anonymous offering that was more eloquent than any apology. And took the blacksmith up on his offer. She spent her days at the forge, the ring of her hammer on hot iron becoming a new, steady rhythm in the town's soundscape. The work was hard, but it suited her. It was practical, tangible. She was building things that lasted. Beth took over the maintenance of the shelter and the wood supply, her quiet competence a constant, reassuring presence. With the small wage unearned, they were able to buy things they had only dreamed of: a proper cast iron pot, a real wool blanket, a new, sharper axe head. They were no longer just surviving, they were building a life. One afternoon, as Beth was splitting kindling outside the barn, a small boy approached. He was no older than 7, his coat too thin, his face smudged with dirt. He was one of the children from the poorest family in town, whose father had been laid up with a broken leg all winter. He stood at a distance, watching her work, his eyes fixed on the thin curl of smoke rising from their chimney. He wasn't begging, just observing, drawn by the evidence of warmth and stability. Beth stopped her work. She went down into the shelter and returned a moment later. She had been baking a small loaf of bread on top of the stove, a luxury afforded by their new supply of flour. She broke off a warm, steaming piece and held it out to the boy. He hesitated for a moment, then scurried forward and took it, his small, cold fingers brushing against hers. He didn't say thank you. He just clutched the bread and ran back toward town. Beth watched him go, the small act of generosity settling inside her like a warm stone. It was the final piece. They had been the ones in need, the ones taking what they could from the world to stay alive. Now, they were the ones who could give. They had become a source of warmth, not just for themselves, but for others. That evening, Anne returned from the forge, tired and stained with soot, but with a deep satisfaction in her eyes. They sat together outside the trapdoor, watching the last of the sun's light fade from the sky. The air was cool but held the promise of spring. The firewood stack in the barn was much smaller now, depleted by their gifts to the town, but it no longer seemed as important. It had served its purpose. They looked out over the valley, at the lights beginning to glow in the windows of Coulter's Creek. They were a part of that, now. Not on the inside, not yet. But connected to it, by threads of work and respect and shared hardship. The shelter beneath them was their anchor, the physical proof of what they had endured and built. "We made it," Beth said, her voice quiet in the twilight. And didn't answer right away. She watched the first star appear in the darkening sky. Then she nodded, a small, definitive movement. "We did."